Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Have you ever been afraid of going to the doctor? Perhaps your fear was related to the fact that in your past life, scary things happened to you in the hospital. Or maybe you just feel threatened by the staff of a medical facility. But not everyone turns out to be so clear-cut. Heroes, the described story, could not feel the danger and in time to refuse surgical intervention in the clinic. And after all, it could have saved their lives. John has been working for several years as a chief physician in a well-known private clinic. He achieved everything on his own with many years of experience and hundreds of successful operations that he performed on his own. The man immediately made a positive impression on all his colleagues at the moment when he first started operating. It was obvious that he had talent and recognition of his chosen direction. How he became the chief physician at the time of the operation and past manager. Died. Cardiac arrest. Despite the fact that it should have been simple and quick without any complications. After that, the management decided to put John in the position, despite the fact that he was the one who performed the surgery on the previous head doctor. Was this done on purpose to get a high position, or a simple accident that could have happened to anyone? That's not for me to know. After all, there was no evidence. John continued to operate despite the fact that he was already the chief physician and could give up some of his responsibilities. He remained a highly successful surgeon for surgery, with appointments booked weeks in advance. At the same time, many people, even for urgent surgery, preferred to wait for some time, just to avoid going to an unknown or young surgeon they had not heard of before. John was even shown on TV a couple of times, as a result of which the fame spread with incredible speed. For several years, the man remained the most successful surgeon in the city. But here and in his practice came a black streak. Operations began to fail, and even the simplest cases became the cause of death. This shocked the public. After all, everyone was used to positive news and guarantees that everything would be successful. The doctor gave assurances on the success of the surgery exactly, but recently he did not do it, so as not to encourage patients in vain. This is what happened during the operation to remove a small qualitative mass, which was located near the food-reel tract. All relatives were sure that the medical intervention would be successful, and the next day, they would already be able to see Christopher, to whom medical paid services were rendered. The patient was physically healthy and had no complaints about his health condition. He had no allergic reaction or intolerance to anything, and so on. But as a result, it was announced to the relatives that the man simply could not wake up after anesthesia. And now he is at the autopsy, so that it was possible to determine the exact cause of death and prescribe it in the conclusion. But how so? The doctor exclaimed the spouse of the deceased man after receiving not the most pleasant news. You said that the operation was simple, that it would be almost 100% successful, and that you could visit him tomorrow morning. Now you're talking about him not being able to wake up from surgery. How can that be? You're the best surgeon in your field. You've performed so many successful surgeries, and my husband couldn't have a successful operation. The woman was crying, not understanding what exactly could have gone wrong. What could have happened at the moment when Christopher was lying on the operating table, and why he was not allowed to see and say goodbye before they sent him for autopsy. Is that how it's done? Understand me, I cannot know exactly how a patient will react to anesthesia and surgery. Before the medical procedure begins, it is only after the incision has been made that the condition can be assessed and certain conclusions can be drawn about how successful the surgical intervention will be. So no 100% guarantees I make, because there may be certain issues with one thing or another. I'm sorry for your loss, but I did everything I could to make the surgery a success. Followed the established rules and recommended sequence of steps for certain treatments, which is what your spouse was enrolled in. Stay strong. Goodbye. The doctor then left without even trying to reassure the family or explain what exactly went wrong, what compensation would be available, and so on. Moreover, he seemed calm and very indifferent to other people's grief, what gave a negative impression of John as a doctor and a professional. My wife continued to cry, not understanding what exactly went wrong, and how it happened that as a result her closest person was no longer around, that she would never hear his tender words or hug him again. After all, she hadn't even had time to say goodbye to him. She didn't have time to tell him how much she loved him and how much she looked forward to seeing him again after the surgery. Because Christopher was sure that everything would go well and therefore flatly refused such conversations. He did not want to even think that something could go wrong, and therefore did not want not to say goodbye, not to talk about the future, which may not be the best. The relatives were given the man's body after the autopsy. In the conclusion, it was written that he died from a surgical reaction to anesthesia, about which the clinic was not warned. In this regard, all charges were dropped, and the doctor was not responsible for the fact that it was he who had a patient die on his shift, and it was he who performed the surgical intervention. The wife looked at the conclusion for a long time, after which she decided to approach John and clarify how this could be. "Excuse me, John, how can it be that my husband died from the fact that he had an allergic reaction to the components of anesthesia, if it was not previously? He had already done several simple operations, and all were carried out successfully. There had been no signs of allergy, and now it suddenly appeared, and it was so severe that it was simply not possible to save my husband. Wouldn't it have been there before? Didn't you do testing before you started treatment? We use innovative components that are rarely used in other clinics until after the surgical treatment. Did we check with you if there is any allergic reaction or not? You assuredly said that you are not allergic to any medical products. You even signed a document proving that you agreed to the use of a certain medication. If there were doubts, you should have asked for a test administration of the drug, but now there is nothing you can do. You just have to accept that something has happened that no one could have foreseen. There's nothing that can be done. I understand, doctor, but you didn't mention the possibility of a test injection before the surgery. We didn't even know there was such a process, so we didn't ask. But you assured me that you have done surgery before, and you are well aware of what will be done and how it will be done, without even hearing about the peculiarities and nuances of it all. In addition, throughout the whole time you assured me that your husband has excellent health and there are no problems with the starting blood count. And after the incision, it turned out that his blood clotting was extremely poor, causing him to bleed profusely. This aggravated his general situation, as a consequence of which his health began to deteriorate rapidly. So we were unable to save him. Christopher, even though there were several medics in the office at the same time. And also in that document that I gave you to review and sign, it also said that you could get additional services to test the drug before it was administered. It was said that after the document was signed, the hospital would be relieved of all responsibility for complications caused by certain drugs that we were not notified about intolerance to. Look at the paper at home, and you will see that it is exactly as I am telling you. If you'll excuse me, I have other patients waiting for my consult. I completely understand. It's hard to get over a loss like that. It's even harder to believe it was your fault. It's a lot easier to try to blame the clinic for what happened. But believe me, we do everything we can to ensure that each of our patients can return home fully healthy and that the intervention is successful. It's just that we are not gods and can't know exactly what will happen during treatment, what complications may arise and how they can be avoided. If we could do that, we would save everyone and anyone without exception. But alas. After that, the doctor went about his business. The wife of the dead man pondered for a few more minutes over all that she had just heard. She looked at the document she had signed with her own hand, which bore the signature of her late husband. They had indeed both confirmed about Christopher not having any allergic reactions and that they were refusing to be tested before the surgery. It turns out that simple inattention cost the life of her husband's loved one. But there was no choice anymore. She had to accept exactly what had happened, that there was no way to change what had already happened. It will be a lesson for life that every paper should be preliminarily studied before signing. 1,000 times to clarify all the points before lying down on the operating table, but how to go on living now. This situation was pretty standard for John. Failed surgeries are as much a part of medical practice as buying new equipment or having all surfaces treated before and after a medical intervention. John was often faced with disgruntled relatives, with numerous threats and various not the most pleasant statements about him, and therefore he reacted calmly enough and to a certain extent, even coldly to everything that was said to him. He had long been considered a cynic. Therefore, it was quite difficult to make John emotional. Of course, he empathized with patients, but to let so many different emotions through himself on a regular basis is something impossible. So he had to learn to keep a low profile, coldly react to various incidents, and not get killed after every bad experience. So did almost all surgeons who had at least some experience of independent surgical interventions. For them, the most difficult thing is the first loss of a patient, which they extremely difficult to survive, and often decide to stop practicing after such a thing. But John was not one to give up on his own goals and desires after the first failure. And it was this trait that helped him to become an excellent practicing surgeon who had an excellent reputation and was confident in his own abilities and skills. He took on the most difficult cases, which often ended in the successful recovery of the patient. After a while, many people in the neighborhood began to notice that the once successful surgeon began to make simple mistakes in operations that cost patients their lives. Of course, in almost every situation there were certain arguments and excuses that completely removed all the responsibility of the hospital and transferred it directly to the patient or his relatives, the presence of hidden pathologies and the like. In general, there were so many moments, which, it would seem, should not have been mentioned, that the chief physician of the hospital got away with it every time. Of course, it can be said that all the happened misfortune is just really a case of unforeseen circumstances. But why then do such circumstances occur only on simple cases, when even the most inexperienced doctor can achieve the desired result? Simple unpreparedness of doctors to face an unexpected situation during surgical intervention. The absence of an extra pair of hands to eliminate the open bleeding due to the self-confidence of the chief physician, or just a carefully thought-out plan in which the main victims are those patients who come for a simple operation and are not very wealthy people. After all, they are the ones who turn out to be the easiest victims, and their relatives believe in everything that only the doctor will say in case of a bad experience. Believe what? It's not clear, but what is known is that once or twice a month in the practice of a brilliant doctor, who for many years has not made a single blunder, errors occur, as a result of which very healthy patients die. For a couple of years, such circumstances went largely unnoticed. The relatives of the deceased patients, although they felt badly about what happened, never started any investigations that could lead to any result. They simply clarified all the points with the doctor and constantly cried about their grief, after which they went home and went on with their lives, only without a loved one. But here in John's practice, there was a young patient who came to the reception and consultation completely alone. Stephen did not want to say anything about his relatives, as he did not want them to know about the surgical treatment. He came for a consultation, clarified the cost, and then disappeared for a while. For John, this was not surprising at all. After all, quite often patients could not afford full treatment, even though discounts were made for some categories of citizens. Simply, the services of the hospital were quite expensive against the background of other offers on the market, since it had an excellent reputation and used innovative equipment on a full scale. Predominantly those who wanted to carry out complex treatment, which was scary to perform in other places due to the lack of equipment of the latest series. But there were also those who simply wanted treatment from a renowned doctor. Despite the fact that in recent years John regularly had failures in performing operations, he was still considered one of the most successful doctors in the city. The lines didn't get any shorter, and after the clinic gave news about the purchase of new equipment, the influx of potential patients became even greater. But what was wrong? The number of unsuccessful operations did not become less after that. In fact, they became even more frequent. Now, twice a month at least, John had to report that the patient had not woken up after treatment, that he had not survived the intervention, and would not be able to return home safely. At that point, John had already stopped thinking. He had decided that the man would not be able to afford the treatment due to the high cost. The patient returned unexpectedly, determined to have the treatment done by the head doctor. He needed a simple bowel operation. The nurse suggested that he should make an appointment with another surgeon or even go to another clinic where the prices would be more reasonable. But Stephen flatly refused such offers. He wanted to be treated only by a specific doctor who could best understand his situation and treat him with minimal harm to his health. Stephen was directed to consult directly with the chief physician, who would operate on him if everything was agreed upon. John was extremely surprised to see the man who refused treatment after hearing the price. He said hello, and then rather arrogantly and even impudently asked, "Do you have the opportunity to pay the full cost of the operation? We don't make any discounts for your group of society, and we don't provide installments, so we can't help you in case you don't have a certain part of money or don't have it at all." I was sure we would never see each other again, but you managed to surprise me about that. Stephen looked carefully at the chief physician and then spoke without long conversations. "I will need to have the surgical treatment as soon as possible. I will have the full amount. I will be able to pay for your service without any problems. But before lying down for the operation, I would like to clarify all the points that are directly related to my treatment and recovery after the operation. How long will it take to recover, and how long before I can return to work? What are the things I should pay special attention to during my preparation? And what are the chances of any problems during the operation? I will be able to operate on you on a first-come, first-served basis at the reception desk. You will be given a leaflet with all the details you may need to know, and just before you start the operation. I will also tell you about what will be performed and how long it will take to recover, and so on, until I have a full list of tests. I cannot tell you any of these things, so you will have to wait a little longer to get the most complete information. You can take the tests in our clinic for a fee, or you can bring the finished results so that we can assess the risks and competently build a plan for the intervention. Ask the nurse to bring the price so you can look at it." "No, thank you. I'll take the tests at another clinic. I'll just bring you the results. After that, you can tell me what the risks will be." John smiled, realizing that the patient refused additional services only because the cost would be quite high. He was used to the fact that almost half of all his patients were in some financial need, and therefore tried to save as much as possible on everything they could. And Stephen was no exception to this group of people. You see, there will be certain risks even if your tests are in perfect condition, and the possibility of something going wrong. It's not going anywhere. Maybe you have an allergic reaction. Maybe the test will reveal that the mass was malignant, and therefore our actions will provoke its development, and so on. We cannot give a 100% guarantee that the operation will be successful, but we do everything possible to make sure that it will be so. That's why our clinic is considered the best in its field here." After a few minutes of hesitation, Stephen agreed to be treated at this private clinic, not even realizing that things might not end up the way he had originally planned. Stephen never came to the clinic with any of his relatives, and on the sign-in sheet, he had listed only one backup number for his mother, which was to be called in case things didn't go as originally planned. He underwent counseling, signed the paperwork for the surgical treatment, and then went to the operating room. There was a waiting list of weeks, and so a repeat of the tests was required. John insisted on taking all the tests at his clinic, as this would save time on the treatment and would not delay the operation for a few more days. Stephen agreed. After receiving successful tests, the operation began, which was supposed to last only an hour. But everything turned out to be not so simple. As a result, the operation lasted almost 3.5 hours, and during all this time the doctors were fighting for their patient's life. Suddenly, he began to bleed profusely, which could not be stopped, even though the office had specialized equipment. quality drugs, and much more. As a result, Stephen did not survive the surgical treatment and died on the operating table. He was immediately sent for an autopsy to determine the exact cause of the problem. To draw a conclusion, only hours after the patient passed away on the operating table, John still made the decision to call the contact number that had been left with Stephen to announce the tragic loss. He made the call, but there was no answer. And the man did not try to call a second time. He simply went about his other business, completely forgetting that it was his responsibility to call the relatives back a couple of hours later or after normal working hours. Stephen has been in the hospital morgue for a couple days now. According to the rules, if no one comes to pick up the body for a couple weeks, they just make up the body. Since the hospital is not supposed to handle the funeral arrangements themselves and spend their own money on the process. But it wouldn't have to do that. After all, on the third day a woman came to the hospital who looked just fine and immediately made an impression of wealth and status. It was the chief physician who first approached her to clarify all her wishes. But what he heard made him really tense. "I'm sorry, my son had an operation here, and he hasn't been in touch with me for several days. He warned me that there might be some complications or other problems. But in that case, you should have notified me. His wife is worried, and his father can't run the business on his own. So I thought I'd come in person to assess the situation and find out firsthand. Can I see my son right now?" John was nervous. He had not expected that Stephen could be the heir of such a wealthy family, and therefore a failed operation could put an end to his career. But there was nothing he could do in this situation. It was necessary to think of a way to explain everything as soon as possible to avoid serious consequences. "That's right. I called you," the head doctor said, "but you didn't pick up. So the hospital decided to call you back in a few days. Just today, we were supposed to make a second attempt to contact you and inform you of what had happened. But you arrived at the clinic before I was free from my morning rounds, so now we can tell you in person. Your son didn't survive the surgery and died before regaining consciousness. It turns out he had some problems with his blood counts. Therefore, we were unable to do anything and save him before complications arose. Several doctors fought for his life, but alas, we couldn't make a difference. He underwent a medical examination and autopsy, which led to a final diagnosis and an assessment of his general condition at the time of his death. I offer my condolences to you, but surgery is an unpredictable process." John continued to stand still, waiting for some sort of response from the woman. Nancy Christopher stood at a complete loss for a few more minutes, then looked at the doctor unhappily and spoke in a serious voice in response to his remarks. "You had no right to conduct an autopsy without the permission of the relatives. This moment had to be agreed upon beforehand, and only after that you had the right to conduct it, if I agreed to it. And now it turns out you did what was right for you, and you're saying that everything was in accordance with the rules. We'll be doing our own research. I'll go to another clinic, and then we'll find out exactly what happened to my son, and how likely was it that he would die on the operating table. Could you please provide me with the tests that were obtained before the surgical treatment at your clinic?" the woman asked. Then she looked at the head doctor with discontent and distrust. "Excuse me, but your son was examined not in our clinic. Therefore, we cannot provide the original documents. He decided to take the tests in some other place. Therefore, I can't tell you what actually happened. I warned him that it is recommended to have the tests done in the clinic where the surgical treatment is planned, but he did not listen to me. The equipment and features of laboratory tests may differ from each other, if in some cases the differences are insignificant. In others, there is a risk of serious negative consequences, which we will not be able to cope with due to the discrepancy between the tests and reality. That's what happened with Stephen, who brought in results from a different organization, and they were unreliable." "I see," the woman replied sharply. "I want to take my son's body to have a funeral. He's been in your clinic for too long already. And after that, we will deal with where exactly he took the tests and why it was decided to refuse the examination in your hospital." Although initially we discussed with him the fact that he will undergo additional examination, I ask you to make all the documents as soon as possible because I have too little time, and any delay may cause the loss of potential profits. Besides, we still need to inform all the other relatives that Stephen is no longer with us, so they won't be expecting him back. I didn't believe in anything. Yes, of course, all the paperwork and bodies will be ready within a few hours, and then you can pick them up. I would like to warn you that the bodies will be heavily refrigerated in the form of coating with a specialized solution that stops the decomposition processes for a while. We do this on purpose so that the deceased retains its original appearance for a very long period of time, so that the relatives can bury him and say goodbye to him in his usual form. John was about to head to his office to start preparing the paperwork, but at that moment he was called out by Nancy Christopher, who looked at her watch and spoke calmly. "I don't have that much time, and I'll turn things over to the funeral home. They will pick up Stephen on their own and carry out all the necessary processes. Keep that in mind. I'll leave you the number of the funeral home. Call me after all the paperwork and bodies have been prepared. They'll take everything. Stephen paid for this himself, so I don't owe you anything. Do you? So if you'll excuse me, I have to go to work now." After saying that, the woman walked out of the clinic and actually headed towards her car. She drove off. John was able to relax a little, realizing that the funeral ceremony would be arranged immediately, as a consequence of which no one would discover anything, which meant that no one would discover anything in time. It is very likely that the relatives of the deceased man will not even conduct any investigations or research, given that even his own mother refused to take her son and put everything in the hands of professionals. Indeed, after all the preparations were completed, a specialized funeral service arrived and assessed the man's condition and took him away for all the follow-up. No questions were asked. Everything was carried out quickly and to the highest possible quality. The staff signed a statement of receipt of the body and then headed off in an unknown direction for the hospital. The next few days passed in tension and heavy waiting. Every call, John investigated as a potential threat, as the last call he would ever hear in his life. He was sure that all his machinations would be exposed, that he would go to jail for a long time and pay out simply unbelievable sums to everyone who had just been hurt by his knife. But nothing happened. So a week passed and a second week began, and at that moment, the man felt much calmer. He realized that his former patient had already been buried, that now no examination could be carried out, so he felt a little calmer. But now it was necessary to do everything possible to ward off all suspicion and restore the reputation that had suffered after the news of the death of an important patient on the surgeon's table. But if he had only known that Stephen would turn out to be a difficult man, who had no rich relatives or any connections, that he would be an important patient who had decided to trust him, he would have made sure to conduct everything so that the operation would be successful and end in the best possible way. But now nothing could be changed. It remains only to wait for the denouement and follow all the news that will only appear around the clinic and directly the chief doctor, who is a practicing surgeon. Of course, Nancy Christopher was not going to leave everything as it is. She was striving with all her might to get to the bottom of what exactly had happened and why a simple surgical intervention had caused a serious problem that had spilled over into the death of her only son. Yes, she did everything so that no news would appear, so that no one would know anything about the fact that she was digging under the head doctor of the hospital who had performed the operation. Otherwise, he could just start covering his tracks, and therefore there would be no way to find any evidence. During the first week, the woman did not take any action. She gave the doctor a chance to calm down and continue practicing so that she would have new evidence against him. And indeed, after only 10 days, John started practicing surgery again, but now he did everything as carefully as possible. He obtained maximum information about the relatives and financial situation of the person by all possible means, and only after that he started the surgical treatment to protect himself as much as possible from all possible problems. In addition, he reduced the number of unsuccessful operations to one per month to minimize the attention to himself and eliminate the risk of new problems that would be associated with his numerous manipulations, which he managed to carry out very successfully. Nancy Christopher was clearly following the doctor closely and at the same time continued to conduct her own investigation, during which she got some very interesting results. And it all started with going to the very hospital where her son preferred to have his tests done in order to get them in the least amount of time and with guaranteed high quality. She went to their family doctor, after which she told him about her son's death and the diagnosed cause of the health problem from the blood. "But there is no such thing," confidently replied the doctor at the private clinic in which the entire family of the deceased Stephen was registered. He was in perfect health. Therefore, the probability that he died for this reason is practically nil. In addition, appropriate examinations were conducted, during which the speed of light was assessed, and tests were taken, which showed that the platelet count was within the normal range. Such statements on your part seem to me to be just nonsense, which has nothing to do with reality. The doctor shrugged, then added, "If you want, I can find the results of the tests and examinations that your son underwent before going to the operation, so you can see for yourself that everything went more than normal, and therefore the possibility of serious problems was simply excluded. Now give me just a few minutes. I'm going to go through the archives." The family doctor left, and in a few minutes returned with the papers, in which all the points directly related to Stephen's state of health were written down. He held them out to Nancy. "Take a look for yourself." Stephen was in excellent health and had been able to survive the operation with flying colors. He had no problems with his blood clotting rate. He didn't experience any pathological abnormalities, and throughout the time treated at our clinic, I noted no significant negative changes in his well-being. He should have had a simple surgery that a surgeon could have performed. So I don't understand what exactly the problem is and how it could have ended up like this. The doctor shrugged, then with a serious expression on his face added, "Or maybe the problem lies in the doctor, and thus he is just trying to hide his own stupidity, a mistake that could not avoid, but in which he just does not want to confess." "That's what I think too." The doctor responded to Nancy Christopher. "I just don't have any proof yet. That's why I'm trying to find out for myself what exactly happened so that I can go to court to investigate and set a final verdict. Otherwise, the hospital can simply justify the situation as a mere accident for which it bears no responsibility. I think it is worthwhile to collect as much documentation as possible first and only then go to the police." "Right," the doctor concluded. "Then take the documents. And if I know anything about John, who operated on your son, then I will call you to tell you everything." Nancy Christopher. She thanked the doctor and went home to familiarize herself with all the tests and compare them with the results that had been obtained at the postmortem and blood draws at the time of the operation at the clinic. It turned out that at the time of the surgical intervention, the blood tests had changed significantly, and for the worse. Platelets were really low, but other blood components were within normal limits. There was also a serious increase in blood pressure, which, as a result, affected the negative outcome of the treatment. But how could this happen if the tests were taken just a couple of weeks before the operation? Couldn't it have changed so much in such a short period of time? Stephen had not taken any medication, had not been ill or undergone any complicated treatment, so the possibility of such a serious problem was ruled out. But then what was the reason for the disappearance of platelets in the blood? Why the body of a young and healthy man did not continue its production at the time of surgical intervention? And could it be somehow related directly to the activity of the clinic and even himself, operating what Dr. John, or still not? The tests alone were not enough to write a statement, because changes in the tests can happen for a variety of reasons. You need some more evidence, proof that the treatment was done incorrectly, and that the head doctor is using the clinic for his own benefit. But what benefit can there be from the death of a patient? What positives can there be after a young man who was practically healthy dies on the operating table? That was something Nancy Christopher had yet to figure out. Me. Surprisingly, the woman was quite calm. Everything that was going on around her, she held firm and hardly cried at all. Didn't think about how hard it was for her in those moments. She supported her daughter-in-law and her husband and remained as firm as flint. Maybe that's why she was able to build her own company, which she passed on to her husband and son in the future. It is this quality and helped her to achieve the truth in the ongoing investigation, which was so qualitatively disguised that could not even think that something would go wrong. But every villain sooner or later gets what he deserves, and the head doctor of a famous private clinic will not be an exception. He will be punished for all these deaths that occurred through his fault, and for all those actions that he conducted illegally. In addition to collecting all the documents that were directly related to her son's medical condition, Nancy Christopher requested a medical examination of the man's body after it was received in the hospital ward. The woman insisted on a full examination and the taking of as many tests as possible, based on which it would be possible to understand exactly what had happened and what manipulations had been carried out on the body after death. It took several days for the examination, and only then did the funeral process begin. Receiving the results of all the tests taken, as well as deciphering, took about a couple of weeks, during which Nancy Christopher was clearly on pins and needles. Now it was up to her whether she could prove that her son had been manipulated beyond what he had agreed to on his own or not. If there had been manipulation, it would be possible to go to the state law enforcement agencies to file a report and punish the perpetrator. If not, then one would have to continue the investigation in order to get the expected results later on. Finally, she was invited to review the results over a period of time. The pathologist was reviewing the numerous papers that lay on his desk, selecting those papers that were directly related to Stephen. He asked Nancy Christopher, what was the purpose of the examination? What would be the next steps if certain results were obtained? And so on. At first, the woman answered the questions calmly. At some point, she couldn't stand it and still clarified. Why are you asking me all these numerous questions? I am paying you a lot of money to do the examination, not to be interviewed before receiving the results. Let's find out exactly what happened and if there are any signs of additional medical intrusion other than what was planned. After that, I will decide what I should do. The man put the documents aside and then spoke in a serious voice. I'm not asking for more information because I have nothing to do, but because it's in my regulations. I am obliged to ask what exactly you plan to do after receiving the results, if they turn out to be this or that, so that you do not do anything to yourself. Do you have some kind of mental illness? So after I give you the information, you'll do something to yourself, and I could be held to some not so pleasant accountability. Nancy sighed heavily and continued to answer the man's numerous questions, realizing that there was no other way to get away from him. And only after about 20 minutes of not the most pleasant conversation, the pathologist began to voice all those results, which were written on numerous papers. Everything was so incomprehensible and confusing that at first Nancy did not understand anything at all and just listened silently. And only after the doctor finished telling about all the results that had been announced earlier, she decided to ask what was going on at all. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Was there some sort of invasion as a result, beyond what had been communicated prior to the surgery? Did the hospital do anything else? Or was the death really only due to the fact that during the operation the results of the tests were unreliable, as a result of which Stephen could not survive the loss of a large amount of blood? And how could the tests have changed in such a short period of time, if he had undergone a full examination before his visit to the clinic? Nancy bombarded the man with questions so much that he was even confused for the first few seconds. Let's discuss everything in a simpler way for understanding. After the examination, it turned out that the operation had not been performed at all. The doctor did not even get to the area to be operated on. Therefore, it is not clear what exactly was done on the day when the surgery was scheduled. The feeling is that an incision was simply made, after which the doctors just waited for the patient to bleed out. They did not even burn the blood vessels or try to make them worse. As a result, after 2.5 hours from the start of the surgery, Stephen supposedly just pulled out, causing him to die. I can't say anything for sure about the lack of platelets in his blood, but it seems that a couple hours before the operation he was injected with some substance that blocked their appearance in the body, while suppressing the ones that were already in the blood. Another thing that's been bugging me is the misalignment of internal organs and some of the inconsistencies based on the initial tests that were given by your primary care physician that were obtained before he went into surgery. So what you're saying is that he had some manipulation of his internal organs and changed their position or something like that. How can that be if the surgery was a simple bowel operation? Nothing else had to be done. Nancy Christopher looked intelligently at the doctor, who continued to scrutinize the numerous papers that had been given to him by other clinic staff. The silence dragged on for several minutes. It was only after the doctor had put the last piece of paper aside that he replied more along the lines that some of the organs just weren't his. They don't match his blood type and some other things, even in size with the ultrasound results you gave us. It feels like he was just given a different liver and kidneys, with a sick person who was in any case unable to take root, even if he had been able to wake up from the surgery. It is not possible to say exactly at what point the organ replacement was done. Opportunity is not provided, since on the analysis of accurate information simply cannot be obtained. But presumably it was either directly during the surgical intervention or immediately after it. At the same time, I can definitely say that the bodies are not particularly well located, and therefore we can conclude that these actions could not have been carried out by a professional, or the professional simply did not try to hide anything. I don't think anyone's going to check anything. The pathologist looked carefully at Nancy, who was simply shocked by such news. What do you mean, they switched organs? How could it be, if Stephen was not in line for any transplants? I mean, there's no paperwork for those procedures either. Can you write me a report that says the organs are not in the right place, and that a transplant was performed? Nancy Christopher asked. I don't know if the doctor will agree to put his words on paper, or if they will remain just words. I just need to get some proof that the treatment performed was not as originally planned, so that the investigation into my son's death can be finalized as soon as possible. Your words could play a significant role in the final decision during the inquest, and I will pay you. The last phrase made the pathologist think about the possibility of additional profit. He hesitated, unsure whether it was worth getting involved in this strange and confusing case. But after the woman placed a very large sum of money on the table, he replied, I will write a report, which will detail all the thoughts and assumptions that have arisen in my head after studying numerous documents, and provide photographs, which will definitely show that there were certain interventions in the position of internal organs. But I would ask that I not be dragged into this case. I can testify once or twice, but on a permanent basis, I do not want to take part in solving an illegal situation. If you're comfortable with that option, then I can draw up a document. Today, while you are in the waiting room, take pictures, and you will already have an evidentiary basis. Nancy Christopher clearly agreed. She realized that it was far from her to decide how often and for what reasons the doctor who had written this receipt would be yanked. And so there was no point in refusing. She went to the waiting room, where she spent a long 3 o'clock, during which the pathologist was drawing up a report. Stephen was working on the body again, in order to take the necessary pictures and provide them to the mother of the victim of the private doctor. As a result, the doctor did bring out the file. She went to the waiting room, where she spent a long 3 o'clock, during which the pathologist was drawing up a report. Stephen was again working on the body in order to take the necessary pictures and provide them to the mother of the victim who had suffered at the hands of the private doctor. As a result, the doctor still brought out a folder which contained everything that proved additional illegal interventions in the man's body. After that, without saying anything, he went back to his workplace, so that no one would suspect or realize what exactly he was handing over to Nancy. The woman already wanted to go to the prosecutor's office in order to write an application to start investigative actions. But at the last moment, she decided to look for something else on the doctor, so that he could not escape his punishment. As a result, it was decided to go to a private detective who could get all the information to which she has no access. And among a huge number of options, she turned to Liam, who was considered one of the best specialists in the direction of private investigations and could fully get information from almost every organization. The meeting was already scheduled for the evening of the same day, so there was no time to waste. Nancy had already wasted a huge amount of time in order to get an opinion from several clinics, and now she just couldn't wait a few more weeks to meet the detective. She offered him double the amount if he'd do the investigation as soon as possible. What makes you think that one of the most famous doctors in our city is capable of doing something like this? Would a man who cherishes his reputation and who tries to make himself and his clinic famous engage in illegal activities, knowing full well that this would be the reason for the termination of his illustrious career? Liam asked Nancy, who, with a serious face, had spent half an hour telling him about her problem and the many speculations that had arisen from it. After some silence, the woman simply handed the man a stack of documents. "Look at this," she said. "I got all this from various private clinics. There is everything from what my son had been sick for the last years to the conclusion of the doctor who, on my order, conducted repeated autopsies. I think you'll find it all makes sense if you read all the documents carefully. Personally, it became clear to me that the doctor is engaged in illegal activities and conducts additional interventions until the moment when they announce to the relatives about the death of the patient. In addition, there are photographs that accurately show incisions on internal organs." The private investigator carefully looked at the numerous documents and footage that was provided to him, after which he agreed to conduct the case. He promised this information in the minimum possible time, but did not guarantee that it would be as reliable as possible and have an evidentiary basis behind it. Nancy agreed. For the next few days, Liam sent her information in the evenings about what he had learned about the surgery. Some things were of particular interest to him and some concerns. He shared many speculations and talked about plans for the next day. On the whole, there was nothing of interest, but exactly until the moment when Liam collected and systematized all the information about John's patients. The conclusions turned out to be simply shocking. The detective invited the woman to meet in order to discuss those points that caused certain questions and misunderstandings for him. In addition, the man managed to find such information that would almost certainly put John, who, as it turned out, had been engaged in illegal activities for a very long period of time. The evidence was sufficient to put the man away and to cover up the operation of the entire clinic that covered up his many violations of the law. It was evident at the meeting that the detective was greatly disturbed by the information he had been able to obtain. In some ways, he was even nervous, despite the fact that he had previously taken on more bizarre and confusing cases. Most likely, John is in the business of selling organs on the black market. He almost certainly cut out some of your son's organs after you said you would be picking up the body, and after learning that you were from a fairly well-to-do family who had the ability to conduct further investigation into the death, he began to panic and put the organs back where they belonged. Of course, it was not possible to return the elements that had already been sold to him on the black market. Therefore, it was decided to simply transplant someone else's organs, hoping that this fact will not be revealed in any way. And here you can just applaud your pathologist, because it is difficult enough to notice such neat stitches. Yes, the organs were not exactly as they should be originally, but many doctors simply do not pay attention to this, because after death in the human body begins to occur irreversible processes that cannot be reversed. But the presence of sutures definitely indicates that there were surgical interventions, and by a professional, no matter what anyone says. But the pathologist said that the work was not particularly well done, and therefore it is immediately noticeable that the organs were burned. But perhaps it was obvious to him, because he had previously encountered such situations. But that person, even an experienced doctor, who had not seen exactly how organ replacement was performed before, would not have been able to say exactly what had been done in Stephen's body. You chose an excellent clinic for your examination. If you had gone to a different organization, chances are you would have been told nothing, or they would have said that your son really just died of blood loss, because that's what the signs looked like. And the body was covered with a specialized solution, not so that your son would be preserved until some relatives showed up. It was so that no outward signs of an organ transplant could be seen. That is why the fact that everything was done for your benefit is so doubtful. It is almost certain that all actions were carried out only to conceal the illegal actions of the clinic staff and also to minimize all suspicions. But as you can see, still found that person who decided to get to the truth. And now the punishment cannot escape the clinic. But has no one ever wondered before about the reason why their loved one died during a simple operation? Surprised? Asked Nancy Christopher. Or haven't there been cases before where the simplest surgery ended up in the clinic in this way? That's the thing, it's not the first time. But no one has ever sought help before because people just haven't had the opportunity to do it. Predominantly lethal outcome was on those operations where there were people who were not particularly wealthy families and whose relatives simply could not afford such an investigation, as it required huge financial investments. That is why many still decided to simply mourn the deceased and bury him in accordance with all traditions. After that, just move on with their lives. I don't have to tell you what a huge financial outlay this whole investigation requires. Liam shrugged, then added, I just can't understand one thing. If all these actions were carried out exclusively with people from poor families, how come Stephen, who was a fairly well-to-do young man, was targeted? This moment does not connect at all with everything that is going on in my head. Also, I don't quite understand why you were not notified of your son's death immediately if your details were left at the hospital as contact information. I think it's because the hospital just didn't know who Stephen was. That's all. He took his father's name, and the company is still registered under my maiden name. That's why a lot of people didn't know anything about my son in this town. He never wrote about his job in the documents and never mentioned his rich parents, so no one in the hospital could even think that he could be a very wealthy young man. And certainly the doctor didn't think that after the death of the guy someone would deal with questions about his death and the investigation of the whole situation. Nancy Christopher said, and then confidently added, John just didn't expect such a development. That's why he did the same thing he did with ordinary people. And now he will get what he deserves. How many people have suffered at his hands? There's no such information anywhere. Well, if we believe all the information we managed to get during the investigation of the case, there were at least 30 people, only 3 of whom tried to find out something. But everything ended at the stage of writing a statement. No one investigated anything further because there was simply no evidence base, and it would have been necessary to pay for all the procedures on their own. And here again, everything rests on the question that people who suffered at the hands of the doctor simply had no money to do anything, and therefore they refused to make a statement, and the case ceased to be investigated. It's like that. That's terrible. Will there be any way to get more information about what kind of people were hurt, to find their relatives, so that it would be possible to write a full-fledged group statement? Because on the basis of it, all actions will be carried out much faster, and the punishment will be more severe. Right. Nancy looked hopefully at the detective, who was looking thoughtfully at his phone. He looked at something carefully for a few minutes, then raised his head and answered, I will be able to provide information about at least 10 people, because I have already learned something about them. But I will try to find relatives of more victims. Maybe someone from the hospital will agree to sell me the information, and then we'll have a complete list of all the victims. That's it. Liam will continue to investigate. Nancy Christopher, I was just waiting for results that would put a man away for sure, and for a long time. There had been no news for several days, and Nancy wanted to dial the detective herself to get all the information about the state of affairs. But suddenly her phone rang just as she picked it up. But it wasn't the detective calling, it was the family's doctor. Hello. Still puzzled, Nancy asked, is something wrong? No one in the family was sick, so the call was a complete surprise. Nancy Christopher clearly no longer remembered that she had asked to call the moment there was any news or details about what John was doing and whether it was possible to get any evidence or proof of his illegal activities. She no longer remembered that conversation. After all, she was sure that everything was going as quietly and discreetly as possible, and their family doctor doesn't have to become a detective to investigate and look for any information. Hello, Nancy. You asked me to call you if I had any important information about the doctor. Of course, I'm not sure how important this information is, but it's very likely that it will help you get closer to solving your case. Yesterday on the operating table at John died a young patient who came with a simple request to remove an inflamed appendix, but the operation was not carried out successfully. And as a result, the young woman passed away without regaining consciousness. Of course, it's possible. It's a simple accident, and there were some complications during the operation. But it doesn't look like that. The operation was as simple as possible, even by my standards, so I can't say definitively what might have gone wrong. You can talk to her young man about what might have happened, and also talk to the parents. They'll be at the clinic tomorrow, if you can see them. You can get a first-hand account of the whole thing. Okay. Cell phone rings. Thank you for calling. By all means, I'll go to the hospital tomorrow and talk to everyone about what exactly happened in that case. If it works out, we can do further investigation into the condition of the injured girl. Maybe it will turn out that she will have the same problems as my son. And then John's illegal activities will definitely be proven. Thanks again. Nancy hung up the phone and then began to think of a plan whereby she could get the examination done and also get an opinion directly from the private clinic where the operation had been performed. In case it didn't work out, then it would be harder to prove the illegality of the doctor's action, and the time limit would be shorter. Since one case can still be justified and reduced to the fact that all this is a simple coincidence, medical error, and so on, you have to do anything to get the opportunity to communicate with the relatives of the dead girl. Get permission for a second autopsy the next morning. Nancy Christopher went to the hospital as soon as she woke up. She didn't want to postpone the case, so she decided to just wait for the dead girl's relatives. Right in the ward. She didn't ask anyone anything, but just sat and waited, realizing that these people will be as easy as possible to find, as without tears and proceedings will definitely not do. And so it happened in the end. A few hours later, a man appeared in the hospital lobby and immediately went to John's office. Then only shouting and proceedings were heard, after which the man promptly left the office and headed for the reception desk. He did not hold back his emotions. How could you even let this happen? Immediately carry the book of complaints, call the chief doctor, who will deal with how your surgeon operates and where his hands grow from. I want to see him now. And don't tell me that the asshole who killed my wife is in charge. Emily was a beautiful person who trusted you, and as a result, she will never see her family again. And his daughter will grow up without a mother because of your negligence and lack of professionalism. He should go to jail after everything that happened. I don't believe this was just an accident and nothing was planned in advance. If you don't do something right now, I'll go to the police station and file a report against you. The girl looked as calm as possible. She didn't react to the man in any way or try to calm him down. And only after he was completely silent, she calmly raised her eyes and indifferently spoke. Man, we carry out all actions strictly in accordance with the established regulations, and therefore there is no fault on our part in what happened. We conducted the operation in accordance with the previously agreed terms. The girl signed the document, and only then we began to carry out surgical intervention. Go wherever you want. We have all confirmations of full consent and familiarization with force majeure situations, and that we completely relieve ourselves of all responsibility for them. That's exactly what happened. And we tried to save your girlfriend, but it didn't work. So please calm down and let me get on with my work in peace. This is my wife, not my girlfriend. How dare you talk to me like that? I want to know exactly what happened to the woman I love, and you're telling me I should just calm down and get out. The man was just beyond furious. His spouse continued to yell and resent him, but as a result, he slowly began to calm down, realizing perfectly well that no one was paying attention to him. After a while, he just sat down on a chair that was located in the waiting room. He closed his eyes with his hands and took a deep breath. He sat in that position for a few minutes, and then he looked up and began to examine his father. It wasn't until he looked at Nancy that she turned to him and began to speak to him in a calm voice. "I understand how hard it is for you to go through such a loss. I was in your shoes not too long ago myself. My son also died while undergoing surgery at this clinic, and I was sure that all this was done on purpose, which in a certain way was favorable to the surgeon. But it turns out that you just have some trouble accepting reality. And it turned out to be just as John said. Right. That's what you were trying to tell me when you started this conversation. Don't worry, I totally understand that it's just part of life. You don't have to accept the loss of a loved one and try to move on. But I can't do that yet. How could she die while performing such a simple surgery? Even the youngest surgeon could have performed it successfully. At least, that's what I thought. But even if the most experienced surgeon in the county couldn't save my wife, then nothing could be changed. And that would have been the outcome anyway. Right. I just can't believe she's not with me anymore. And the fact that now I have to tell my daughter that she won't be able to see her mom anymore. But we'll get through this. The most important thing is to get through today. It'll get easier from here. What happened to your son? Complications from the surgery too. Right? That's what they told me, anyway. But I knew he was in perfect health. So I requested all the documents and started investigating the case. And after a few weeks, it turned out that the death during the surgical treatment was pre-planned, that my son simply had no way to survive it, and therefore he just bled to death on the surgical table. It was only after I went to another clinic for a second autopsy that it turned out that the internal organs were not positioned the way they should have been originally. That is, it turned out that the doctor had carried out some additional manipulations, in addition to those that were agreed upon beforehand. Those that were spelled out in the document that my son signed when he was admitted to the hospital. What are you talking about? How can it be that the surgery wasn't done as originally planned? This is the best clinic in the city. It has a great reputation. John has a great reputation, and so does the clinic. Years of experience in appeals. That's true. But those facts don't mean he can't engage in illegal activity. The result is just the opposite. I already have ample evidence that my son's organs have been cut out and replaced with ones that don't fit him at all. And I will get to the truth anyway, and the perpetrators will be punished. The only question is whether you want justice and find out exactly how your wife died. Or would you prefer to remain in ignorance and believe that it was a simple accident which occurred on your wife during a simple operation, and not while you were treating some complicated and expensive case in the practice of the hospital? Nancy looked carefully at the man, who was sitting in total confusion across from her and thinking about something. I understand perfectly well that you were able to get the truth and that you have the opportunity to do all this. But I just don't have the money to do more tests and hire detectives. We can barely find the money for this operation, and therefore, I can't afford it. The man lowered his head, making it clear that he was extremely frustrated by the circumstances, feeling a certain helplessness and undisguised annoyance. He looked once more at Nancy, who had continued to glare at him all this time. But I didn't tell you that you'd have to spend a huge amount of money. I just asked you if you wanted to get to the truth. And you started talking about money and your financial well-being, which I'm not interested in at all. So do you want to know what really happened to Emily? Or would you rather just bury her and forget about what happened? Just move on with your life and find a new wife. What are you talking about? The man was indignant. Then he looked at Nancy carefully and added, of course, I want to know what happened to my wife. And of course, I want to get to the truth in the matter that has to do with her. But what is required of me? If it's not money, I just don't understand what I need to do. I'd have to do some paperwork or just authorize you to take my wife's body. That's correct. You just have to give me your wife's body so I can give it to my doctor. This is a follow-up autopsy. Then we'll be able to understand exactly what happened to the girl and why she died. And you will also need to take the documents from the hospital, on the basis of which it will be possible to get information about what happened, what tests were at the critical moment, and so on. The man agreed to everything, but only on the condition that his spouse would be given to him in a befitting manner. Nancy promised that the autopsy would be carried out as carefully and qualitatively as possible, and no bright traces would remain on the surface. The man took all the documents and handed them over to Nancy Christopher. And then it was up to her. She contacted the same pathologist who had examined her son and asked him to do the same, and especially to check the correctness of the location of the internal organs. And she was not at all mistaken in her guesses. The girl was found to have the same points as her deceased son, except that no one had installed other organs. She was simply left without them, and it was simply impossible not to notice it. The pathologist sent the photos to Nancy, after which he drew up exactly the same document as before. The body was returned to the husband, and the woman now had proof of the massive operation to remove the internal organs, which could be confirmed by photographs and available reports. In fact, there was nothing to indicate that there were any problems with the internal organs from the external signs, because in the private clinic all the bodies were covered with a specialized solution that kept the body in perfect condition, and even a few days after the transplant was performed. Outwardly, the body remained the same as a normal person who had died of the simplest natural causes. At Nancy's request, Emily was swabbed at the hospital to see exactly what the body was covered in, to understand how it could remain in perfect condition for such a long period of time. The results have been in preparation for quite some time. Nancy Christopher got a list of all the victims in the hospital that she could find out anything about from what the hospital and staff knew about. There were over 20 of them, and all of them had the addresses and contact numbers of relatives listed at the hospital. This should have been enough to contact all of them and try to make a collective statement. It did. Nancy Christopher, Anna, immediately after receiving the list, started contacting all the relatives and asking them to draw up a paper detailing all the points relevant to what exactly had happened to their loved one. Some refused, but most still agreed to the woman's request. A few days later, Nancy Christopher again collected almost 20 different statements, in which were spelled out all the moments that confused relatives and became the cause of certain misunderstandings. Many of them even attached documents and statements from the hospital, on the basis of which it could be understood that the situations of accident and loss of a large amount of blood were very similar to each other. It all looked as suspicious as possible, and in any case it should have raised certain questions for the investigator, the answers to which could only be obtained by questioning the surgeon, on whose shift all this had taken place. That was the calculation. The sheer number of documents that were simultaneously filed by Nancy and Christopher in the police station raised a huge number of questions and misunderstandings that could only be resolved in one way: inspecting the doctor's office and checking his credentials, interviewing him, and going through all the information from his phone and computer. This is where the cases that were previously filed were brought up, and they were also added to a folder with numerous applications for John. A search and seizure authorization was obtained in minimal time. The law enforcement officers then proceeded directly to the clinic. They proceeded without any warning, as they were supposed to. That is why there was panic in the hospital. The girl at the reception desk immediately reported the presence of law enforcement officers in the John Clinic department. The man panicked, completely unaware of what exactly to do to minimize the likelihood of any problems. He threw the phone out the window, and it just happened to be in the dumpster. And right after he closed the window, he was arrested and began an active search, during which they found nothing but numerous documents that were in all the desk drawers and on the shelves. The only thing that confused the law enforcers was that almost all the files with deceased patients were kept separate from the main ones. Consequently, the decision was made to take the file away for further investigation into the matter. John resisted and refused to go to the ward, citing that he had professional commitments, that all the available charges had no direct bearing on him. But all the resistance had no effect. The man was taken away anyway, after which they went to the police station to interrogate him and leave him until the relationship was clarified. Perhaps the whole situation would have taken on less serious circumstances. But suddenly a vagrant appeared at the police station who approached the investigator and held out the very phone that John had thrown away the moment he was informed of the presence of police at the clinic. After seeing the phone, the head doctor of the hospital realized that there was no point in continuing to resist and trying to justify himself. After all, he realized that all the information was about to come from his gadget. He just sat silently on the bench and was completely silent. "Excuse me, but what kind of phone didn't they bring you?" asked the investigator. "To twirl it in my hands. We don't search for cell phone owners. If you want, you can just leave it with us. And if there is any report, we will definitely give the device directly to its owner. Is that okay with you? Or did you want something from me?" "No, let me tell you exactly what's going on. I saw the head doctor of the hospital throw away his phone in a very strange and unexpected way, despite the fact that this device is quite expensive. At first, to be honest, I just wanted to sell it to get some money for food and other things. But after seeing the numerous video galleries, I decided that this device will be of more use to you. There you will find something that will help you understand who the attending physician really is and what he does to his patients." He glanced at the phone, then said goodbye and simply walked away. The man did not leave any information about himself and did not ask for anything. The investigator went to his office and started going through the many files that were on the mobile device. And with each new file that was opened, more and more horrible facts became clear about who the man was who had been conducting numerous transactions for a long period of time and taking huge amounts of money for them. What was on the video? In the first footage, there were some sort of medications that, as the doctor himself said, when examined, helped lower platelet counts to such low levels that in some patients they didn't even track in blood tests. In the video, John was addressing some friend of his who was advised to use this particular remedy in order to simulate death during surgeries from blood loss. Everything was described so colorfully and in such detail that even the investigator, who in his life has seen a huge number of horrors, twitched, each time opening new footage. And if the first videos were just detailed descriptions, the later ones already had John's dead patients. In the videos, the man showed the quality of the organs and talked about the cost of certain elements. After that, he gave a number for pre-order and told about the conditions of delivery. There were a huge number of such videos, and therefore it was immediately clear that all the information that Nancy Christopher was telling about turned out to be true. She did not lie, did not support any documents and photos. She really believed in all the things she was talking about, and was certain that her son's organs had been cut out. And here she is, a video of Stephen talking about his organs and what is planned to be excised and sold in the near future. It was also clarified that there is limited time to book the organs as the surgery took place a few hours ago, and therefore the transplant needs to be done in the minimum time to eliminate the risk of organ rejection. All these clips were direct evidence of the man's guilt and black surgery, which apparently had a huge customer base, and there were those who bought organs on a regular basis, knowing full well that they belonged to people who did not consent to the removal and sale. The investigator spent several hours commenting on everything he had seen in the videos. He then created a copy of all the files from the mobile device and put them in his personal files. He spent another few hours organizing the entire stack of statements that brought Nancy Christopher, obviously from people who had suffered at the hands of the surgeon. It was only after that that he came out to John to speak to him. The man sat completely, calmly, saying nothing and asking for nothing. "But that you will write a sincere confession?" asked the investigator. "Of course, I don't believe it will help you in any way, but in such a case, maybe at least partially your conscience will be cleared of all that you have done in the meantime. Besides, this kind of thing would go a lot faster. I wouldn't want to drag this out for months. Oh, and I'm sure you don't want to see all those many people, relatives you killed so brutally for your own gain." John sat completely silent for a few minutes, obviously pondering the investigator's suggestion. After which he spoke in a whisper. "Listen, maybe we can make some kind of arrangement. I have a huge amount of money. I can fulfill any of your wishes, and you just let me out. I guarantee you there won't be any more situations like this with operations. I'll be done with this whole thing if I get out. I'll give you any car you want. We'll go to the dealership right now. You can have any car you want, and I won't ask you anything more for it. Or not. You want an apartment. Everybody wants an apartment. You'll have one in the center of the city with a great renovation, and they'll give you money to buy what your apartment lacks. Anything you want, you can have, but don't put me in jail. I'm a successful surgeon. What happens to my reputation and my clinic after I get out? I won't be able to operate and save lives anymore. Imagine how many people need me. How many of them have an appointment with me? But you can't imagine the next few months. They can't go on living without surgery at the clinic. You want me to tell you how you're gonna keep operating, right? I'm not, because it's highly unlikely you'll leave the prison alive. You'll probably get a life sentence that you can't get out of, so you'll have to enjoy yourself behind bars. And as for your hospital, it's not gonna be a good one. If it turns out any of the staff were covering up for you, they'll be sitting right next to you. And I'm sure most of them did. I mean, you threw your phone away before you saw us. As a result, the clinic will simply close because it won't be able to withstand the huge amount of scrutiny and negative reputation. It won't be able to recover either. So don't worry. You're not the only one who will be punished for everything you've done. And about that suggestion about granting my wish, it's a very interesting option. I've already thought of it. Anything you say, I'll do it. I just want to avoid a future like you're describing. I don't want to spend the rest of my life enjoying a prison vacation. That's not really an option for me. I'll do anything. What do you want?" John had some hope in his eyes that he might actually be released now. How many things nowadays can be solved with money without much trouble to get a huge number of opportunities and even get out of jail before even getting into it? But suddenly he heard a completely different answer than he had hoped for. "I want you to sit for a long time, and in a high-security cell, so that you will no longer walk the streets of this city and conduct any operations. But what will it take to fulfill such a wish? Or how? And exactly I will be able to realize my wish completely, independently, without your direct participation in this matter. That's exactly what I will do. There's no way you can escape liability and attempted bribery. I'll also put it in the application so that the court will consider all the points. By the way, there was a camera here, so there's no way you can justify anything. So start getting used to the fact that soon you will go on indefinite and free vacation, in which you will spend many years of your life. Is there really no way to negotiate with you?" John exclaimed, approaching the bars. "Everybody needs money in this life. And I'm sure you don't earn enough to need anything. I can't believe the civil service has stopped taking bribes. That's a load of crap." John said it as loudly as possible to attract the investigator, who was on his way to his office. Indeed, a lot of people do take bribes, and I don't rule out the possibility that some even agree to bail out for a while. And perhaps I would have been kind and favorable to you. But after seeing my own sister on one of the commercials, who was also sold out, that's something, then all your chances of negotiating are over. So I advise you to sit silently in the cell, so you don't say anything unnecessary and complicate your life. And for shouting, I can transfer you to solitary confinement or call a medic to give you sleeping pills." After these words, John was completely silent, sat down on the bench, and simply waited for the final verdict, which would allow him to know exactly what would happen to him in the near future. The investigator allowed those relatives to come to the ward who wanted to look into the eyes of the surgeon who deliberately killed their loved one, to talk to him, to ask why, and for what exactly their loved one was killed. The head doctor of the hospital preferred not to react to the visitors and not to react to everything they said. It was much easier for him to keep silent than to enter into a conversation and start arguing, proving something and clarifying some points with relatives of dead patients. He understood perfectly well that he would not be able to justify himself or get away with it. Therefore, the easiest way to end the conversation and proceedings as soon as possible. It is simply not to react to them. A few days later, the long-awaited trial took place, where all the points that were directly related to the case of John were considered. He was sentenced to life in prison, with no right of appeal, despite the fact that his family had hired an excellent lawyer. He had no impact on the case and failed to provide improved accommodations for the man. This was not at all surprising given how many things, illegal and wrongful things, he had done in recent years. After John was jailed, numerous inspections of the clinic began, the main task of which was to find accomplices to the crime who would also be charged. Many employees were found who covered up the criminal activities and even received a certain percentage for the organs sold. But some employees of the clinic really did not know that within its walls black surgery was being performed, which has successfully flourished in recent years. The clinic was ordered to pay millions of dollars in compensation to all those who suffered under John's actions. As a result, the clinic closed not so much because it was categorically understaffed, but because it simply went bankrupt from the numerous payments that had to be made to everyone who had just suffered from everything that had happened. The clinic closed down, but not the most pleasant gossip and news about her went on for many more long years. People became wary of new private clinics and were careful to choose new doctors, so as not to get into the situation that happened earlier with John Grigorievich. Nancy Christopher got justice and was able to reach the logical denouement of everything that happened. She was able to get to the bottom of it and get financial compensation. And if she didn't need it, the other victims needed the money. That's how it happens in life, that public heroes turn out to be the most terrible people who behind the backs of the public lead such a dark life that it's scary to even imagine. Well, good always triumphs over evil. And so John received a well-deserved punishment, which he will now serve for the rest of his life.